Okay, so before we dive into the next storyline for DC Bloodlines, I do want to say something real quickly. In each video, I may repeat myself over the whole idea of DC Bloodlines, and I do know for some people out there, they don't really like the idea of me doing that, but here's the reason why I do it. Because for some folks out there, they're just getting into comics. And for some people out there, they may have never heard of this event at all, and they're kind of wondering, like, what is DC Bloodlines all about? And they might jump into part 4, 5, or 6 before they dive into part 1. And so for me, I kind of do it as a way to help those people out. Now, for the ones out there who don't like the idea of me doing that, please just go ahead and skip over the first like minute or two in the video, and then I dive right into the storyline. It's not me complaining, it's just me saying, like, hey guys, I'll make everything easier for everyone in some type of way. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into DC Bloodlines Part 4, which does take place in the Flash Annual number 6. Now, as we all know, when it comes to DC Bloodlines, it was an event done in the early 1990s where you had DC trying their best to figure out how to fix DC. Because in the early 1990s, DC was beginning to struggle. When it came to Marvel, they had Spider-Man and the X-Men just taking off left and right. And you didn't have Image just pop out of nowhere. And of course, that also brought in a range of brand new characters that comic book fans fell in love with. And so when it came to DC kind of felt stuck where they weren't really able to push forward and join Marvel and also Image in the new era of comics. And so for DC to say, you know what? How about we try a new idea, a new event to introduce new characters that could possibly bring in new fans, but also old fans into our comics once again? And that led into DC Bloodlines. Now, DC Bloodlines was this event that came out in the early 1990s, and really each chapter took place in a series annual. So, for example, you had Man of Steel Annual number 2, you had Lobo Annual number 1, and so on and so on. But each chapter of this event was a way to introduce a new character into the world of DC Comics, and kind of hoping that with these new characters, fans might fall in love with these new characters and want to sit down and learn more about them. And so by this point, we already met a few characters like Edge or Layla and also Joe Public. But now it's time for us to jump into Flash to introduce a new character who did somewhat stick around in DC Comics and Flash Comics for a brief moment. And that would be Argus. Now, when it comes to Argus, DC really did try to push this character. And matter of fact, when it came to Argus, he would reappear a few more times in Flash Comics. And matter of fact, after Bloodlines had officially ended a couple years after, they gave Argus his own miniseries. So they were really trying to push this character in the 90s of DC Comics. But in this particular storyline, we're going to learn how in the world did Argus become the hero we all know of today. And so getting into the opening pages of this particular issue, we pick up with Nick Kovac. Now, Nick Kovac will become Argus, but for right now, he's just a regular person. Now, at first, we get the idea that Nick works for the mob. Like, he's part of the huge mob family in the city. And so we do see him right now meeting up with another character known as Lou. Now, while you do have the two characters have their conversation with one another, we learn here that Nick is technically an FBI agent who went undercover to hopefully bring down the mob family that he had officially joined, better known as the Combine. And so when it comes to Nick, at first, it does seem like his meeting with Lou is about him going after somebody else who's trying to bring down the entire organization. But then you have Lou tell Nick that he knows that he is an FBI agent. So it does seem like right here and now, we are going to see the death of Nick, like right off the bat. But then luckily for our young hero, he is somewhat safe, but at the same time attacked as well by bloodline parasites. Now, DC had used the bloodline parasites as a way to introduce their wave of brand new characters into the world of DC Comics. Now, by this point in our coverage of DC Bloodlines, we have no idea where these bloodline parasites came from. But again, they're being used as a way to introduce these new characters because when they first appeared in part one, they appeared out of nowhere in the middle of space. You had Legion and also Lobo work together to fight against the bloodline parasites out in the middle of space, but then they were able to sneak away onto Earth. And so once they had arrived on Earth, they began to go around and attack regular humans and drain their spinal fluids. And that method right there is the way DC was using to introduce these brand new characters, because most of the time for the bloodline parasites, once they drain someone's spinal fluids, they die. But occasionally somebody's metagene activates when they go through that process. And so when it comes to Nick, he's trying his best right now to get away from the bloodline parasites. Lou ends up dead, but you also have Nick get his spinal fluid drained just like Lou. The only difference is that his metagene activates. And so once it does, it allows him the ability to survive. And so once you have the bloodline parasites disappear, the police arrive, they take Nick over to the nearby hospital. Now we do switch over to Linda Park and also the Flash. Now for me personally, I kind of want to sit down and talk about why I do not like DC Bloodlines. Well, one of the reasons why I don't like DC Bloodlines, but I like this chapter right here, because the problem I had was each chapter was a way to introduce a new character, right? But the problem was that each book did not do a good enough job to kind of allow me the chance to care for that new character, to kind of hope the new character would get their chance in DC Comics and then possibly get their own book. Like, for example, when it came to Edge and Joe Public, those two characters, I didn't really care much about them because technically DC did not do a good enough job to kind of focus on those two characters alone to kind of make me care for them. Now, Layla in the first chapter, I kind of like her a tad bit more because DC at least tried a tad bit more there to kind of make me care for her character. Now, when it comes to Argus, in this one particular book, DC does an amazing job saying, hey, this is Argus, and we want you guys to focus on him. So for Flash, even though technically this is his book, he only appears in the early pages and the last few pages of the storyline, which of course means it allowing the book to focus more on Argus to get fans to care for more about him. Now, Linda Park is also somewhat important in this storyline. And the reason why, because Linda is a reporter, so her main goal is to get the stories out there to the public. And so once she heard what happened to Nick and also Lou, but Nick was the only one to survive, of course she wants to question Nick. Now for Nick, he still has to play that role as the undercover FBI agent, but also kind of make sure like his cover does not get blown. Now, there was a guy with him, a guard with him that came from the mob family. But once you do have Nick being able to kind of get rid of Linda and also his bodyguard, you then have Nick go out of his way to call up his actual boss, who's part of the FBI. And that would be Marty. Now for Nick, he feels like the creatures who attacked him, they're part of the Combine. Now the Combine were a very interesting concept in DC Comics, but over in Flash Comics. And the Combine is one of the largest weapon dealers in this part of the galaxy. Their usual method when moving in on a new planet is to use mostly local operatives. Hence, when they decided to form a presence on Earth, they had chosen Keystone City and they formed a criminal organization to kind of replace the existing mob family in Keystone City. And so when it comes to Nick, he believes it was the Combine because they have weird weapons, weird agents. And so he feels like those creatures were also part of the Combine. And so it's up to him to kind of prove that he is correct. Now his boss says, leave it alone. But for Nick, he can't leave it alone. Now, we are technically given a couple more pages of us seeing the bloodline parasites feeding off on, well, some more random people in the area. Now, we do learn right now that the bloodline parasites, they're hiding out in the abandoned slaughterhouse. Now, that right there become very important for the ending of the storyline. But now we have to shift back over to Nick. Because for Nick, this is where he discovers his abilities. Because for Nick, while he's walking around the city, first he realized that he now has enhanced vision. But on top of that, for Nick, while walking around the city, he does see this old man getting jumped by some random thugs. And so you have Nick agree to help out. Now, at first, for Nick, he's right now hiding in the shadows. And when it comes to him hiding in the shadows, nobody can see him at all. That's one of his own special abilities. Of course, he also gets super strength, super durability, the usual like superhuman powers you get after gaining your abilities. But you didn't have Nick being able to bring down the thugs. Now, because you have the bloodline parasites going around killing people and leaving dead bodies left and right, of course, now you have the police getting involved, trying to figure out who are killing off these people. Now, for Linda Park, her being a reporter, she also wants to tell a story about the recent dead bodies popping up across the city. Now, for the sheriff, he's not really able to give information over to Linda about what's going on with the dead bodies because technically homeboy has no idea at all. But when you do have the sheriff walk away, when you do have the forensic team arrive to the scene of the crime, for Linda, she finds sawdust on the ground. And the sawdust on the ground is going to begin the process of Linda doing her own investigation to figure out who is the actual killer going around Keystone City, even though technically we already know it's the bloodline parasites. Now, when we do switch over to, well, Nick, he's now Argus. The dude went out of his way to put together a superhero suit to use out there in the field. And so for him, he's kind of, okay, cool. I still believe that it was the Combine who had sent those creatures after me. And so he heads over to the Combine headquarters. The only problem is that while he is there, he comes to find out what he believed is completely wrong. The Combine had nothing to do with the bloodline parasites. Now, things get even worse for Argus because while he's trying to listen in on a conversation, you have some of the bloodline parasites actually appear. Now, for Argus, he does try to battle against them. The problem is that for Argus, he's not really that powerful enough to battle against these creatures. These creatures are really powerful. Now, the thing is, so far in our coverage over the whole idea of DC Bloodlines, we have not seen the bloodline parasites fight against a powerful foe except for maybe Lobo. And that's really it because so far we saw them fight against Steel and also Batman. And that's technically it. And also the new DC Bloodline characters. But either way, by the end of the battle, you do have the bloodline parasites being able to escape. Now, for Linda Park, you had her still go on her own little investigation. And of course, that led her over to the old slaughterhouse because she found that sawdust. Now, she does see somebody outside the abandoned building. The problem is that that's not a regular person. That is actually a bloodline parasite because they have the ability to shapeshift. So just like that, Linda Park is captured, and I want to say her cameraman is officially dead. Now, for Argus, the clues that he found, it led him over also to the abandoned slaughterhouse as well. And with his enhanced vision, he sees the creatures inside the building. The problem is that you didn't have the Flash appear, who's right now looking for, well, Linda. And so at first for Flash, he believes that Argus has something to do with Linda. But for Argus, he's kind of like, who the heck is Linda? But then they're attacked by bloodline parasites. But this kind of leads into the whole idea of the ending of the book. And it's kind of the same thing you see in all the different bloodline chapters. At the very end of the books, you always have the new hero and the old hero working together to fight against the bloodline parasites. So right now, we're seeing the Flash and Argus fight against two different bloodline parasites, but at the same time, still being able to find Linda. Now, for Flash, he's also able to kind of temporarily blind one of the bloodline parasites. But when he does cause a small explosion, the flames from that explosion do cause the bloodline parasites to also retreat, but mainly because of their injuries as well. But while they are retreating, you do have Argus being able to find Linda, and you then have Flash be able to grab both Linda and also Argus and get them the heck out of that building before it officially blown up. Now, once you do have our heroes being able to get out of the building, when you have Flash and Linda turn around, Argus disappeared. And so now they're kind of wondering, like, who is that guy and will we see him again down the road? And technically they will, because for Argus, he does stick around for a short while in the 1990s.